It's a happy little flock of birds, full of texture and color. Join me today as I stitch this piece. I'm going to talk about what intuitive stitching means to me and go over step by step how I slow stitch this piece. I'm going to show the supplies I used and talk about my approach to creating layers of texture and color. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. I'm starting with a piece of felt that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I'm going to build my fabric collage, and I have one piece of patchwork that's left over from another project, and I want to use that up in this project. So I've grabbed a couple of extra pieces of fabric to add to that, and then I'm going to baste it down. I'm using regular sewing thread, and I'm going to take small stitches on the front and larger stitches on the back. I do place a knot at the end of my thread, and that just keeps it from pulling all the way through. So I move my way around the piece, basting everything in place. Of course, you can use pins for this if you prefer. Basting's just my preferred method. Now I'm selecting embroidery floss for my project. I've picked light and dark shades of the colors that I find in here. So I've got some greens and some blues. And I'm going to start with my darkest blue for my first pass of stitching. I'm using 2 strands of floss, and this is just going to be regular running stitch. I'm going in and out, starting with this lightest turquoise piece, and I'm going straight across, and it really depends on the thickness of the fabric and what's easiest for me in the moment, whether I take one stitch at a time or whether I stack up several stitches before I pull it through. So I'm going to take this color back and forth until I get to the very edge of this light blue piece. And then I'm going to change colors. And I'm going to go in different directions just to mix it up a bit. And this is my first pass of many, many layers of stitching. So here's all my running stitch, almost complete. I've brought in some green. I've brought in another shade of blue. I'm just covering all the areas. And when I feel like everything's secure, then I can also flip my piece over and remove all of my basting stitches. And to do that, I just bring in my scissors and I clip the stitches, which is easy to do because there's such large stitches on the back, and I pull them out. So now that that's done, I'm going to bring in birds. So the first thing to do is to decide if I want one larger bird or if I want multiple smaller birds. I think both would be nice here. I kind of like the idea of smaller birds, and I could make several of them and sort of have them all roosting together. So I think I'm going to do that. This little bird is from my mini template set. I'll put a link in description. It's also available as a PDF download. I'm thinking about using a contrasting fabric because it will really make the birds pop. I have these pieces of fabric that are this really nice pink fuchsia color. I dyed these using my Dynaflow paints, and I have another video showing that process where I used greens and blues. The process is the same. And so I just have these little snippets that I think are really going to be nice here. So I'm bringing in my erasable pen. This is a friction pen, and I'm using the one with the finer tip. Both would work though, but you can see here that the 5 is quite a bit smaller than the 7, and that's going to make it just a little bit easier to trace. So I just place the template where I want it on the fabric. This fabric's nice on both sides, so I pick a side and I just trace the bird. So here I've traced 3 birds, and I'm going to cut them out. I'm just going to use my small embroidery scissors for this. This is a thin cotton fabric. So here are the birds cut out. I'm just going to take a final look at them and see if there's any areas that I want to trim because I can still see my lines. And then I'm going to come in with some heat and I'm going to erase those lines. If you look closely, you can see that with this dyed Dynaflow fabric and the friction pen, when you erase it, it tends to leave a little white shadow there. So just be aware of that, and that may or may not be important depending on the project you're working on. For me here, I'm not concerned about it. It's going to disappear with all the stitching that I'm going to do. So now that my birds are all ready to go, I just have to decide where I want them to be on my piece. So I move them around. I'm thinking about what looks good to my eye, what way I want the birds to be facing. And when I'm doing that, I decide that I want more birds. So I bring in 2 more. Now, one of them, I've used a different color fabric. I thought that would be nice. I had a tiny little snippet of this sort of orangey pinky color made with those same Dynaflow paints. So I brought that one in, and I'm putting it against that darkest area. That's quite a bit different than the tones of the rest of the piece. It's a very, very dark tone. So I thought having a different colored bird there would be fun. And then I'm picking matching embroidery floss for the 2 shades that I have for the bird, and I'm going to stitch them on. I'm not going to baste them this time. I'm going to use my small applique pins to attach the birds. These are really handy when you're working with really small pieces of fabric. And I'm going to use 1 strand of floss to stitch these birds on. Because they're so small and the fabric is so thin, and I'm not really sure at this point what kind of stitching I want to do on the birds, and so I'm using a matching color, tiny stitches and 1 strand. So that's going to secure them nicely, but it's not going to add any extra marks. It's going to be very subtle. The fabric that I've cut these birds out of is a very thin cotton. So I'm being very slow and careful with my stitches because this fabric is really prone to fraying. And using the Dynaflow paints has actually stiffened them a little bit, not much, but enough so that that helps with the fraying, but it's still a concern here. And while I don't mind fraying, I don't want it to fray so much that I lose the nice round shapes of the bird. So the process of stitching on these birds is very, very slow and very careful with these tiny little stitches. So I just take my time. So now all my birds are stitched on, and I'm going to take a look at the piece so far. And I'm going to see how the fabric has shifted in relation to the batting on the back, and I'm going to do a little bit of trimming. Now I'm going to come in with some pearl cotton. This is an orange color that's close to that red orange of the bird. It's a little bit lighter, but it's close enough that the eye is going to see it as a very similar color. And so I want to move that color around so that it's not just where the bird is, it's in a couple more places. So I've decided to use slow stitching lines, very similar to what I've already done, except I'm making them a tiny bit smaller and a tiny bit closer together, just for a bit of variety. So I've done several lines here on this right side, and I'm going to continue and add some more. So here you can see I've done that stitching in 3 places. That's acting to unify the piece, and it's adding color. And now I want to add some bird eyes. And I'm going to do that with French knots. I like to use milliner's needles to stitch French knots, and that's because the eye is the same size as the shaft. These are the ones I use. Both these brands are good. So I've knotted my thread, and I'm coming from the back, right where I want the eye to be. I'm winding my thread around my needle 3 times, and I'm going back in right beside where I came out. I'm pulling the thread tight, and then I'm pulling the knot all the way through. And that's my eye. You can also use a marking pen here and put a little dot where you want the eyes to be. And that can act as a little guide. So you don't have to think too much about where you're going to put your knots. So I have 1 more to do. So this is what I do on the back. I take a little stitch just to secure the thread. And then I come up, wrap 3 times, and go back in right beside. I pull my thread tight before I pull the needle through, and then I've made my knot. At the back, I take a couple stitches just to secure everything, and then I tie a knot. So there we are. Now I'm going to come back in with my heat, just in case there's any marks there that hasn't been covered up with my French knots. Just hovering it over top because I don't want to flatten out those tiny little French knots. And now I'm ready to add more stitching. I'm going to bring in Pearl Cotton size 8 in white, and I'm going to do some stitching in the other direction, and I'm starting in this patch that's the darkest tone because I want to add a bit of contrast here. And I'm hoping that the white stitching will lighten it up a little bit and blend it with the rest of the pieces. So this stitching is going to alter the color of the background slightly, and it's going to add another layer of texture. So I'm going to continue with this white stitching and bring it up into the other areas of the piece. And I'm going to go in the opposite direction to my first round of stitching. This is going to blend everything together, having the same color stitched in more than one spot. And it's also going to add lots and lots of texture. And I'm at the point in the piece now where I'm thinking about the edges, and I want to contain the piece, and I'm going to do that by adding blanket stitching around the edges. So I've chosen one of the colors that I stitched on the birds, this pink color, and I'm going to go all the way around the piece. So to create the blanket stitch, I come in through the back, and you can really start anywhere, and I bring my needle up. I hold the thread to the side with my left hand so that when I come up with a stitch, I'm forming a loop, and all the stitches will be connected. And as I go around, I'm allowing those stitches to just slightly fold the edges of the fabric under. It's still going to be raw edge, but it's going to add a small element of containment and finishing that I'm looking for. So when I'm finished going around with this color, I'm going to look at it and decide if I want to add some more color. I'm thinking I'm going to do a sort of an uneven amount of stitching where sometimes I'm going to place the stitches really close together and other times farther apart. So here you can see I've brought in that red-orange color as well, and I've gone around the piece several times. And that's really added an extra element of that pink color, and it's helping me know what I want to do next with the piece. And what I want to do next is outline these birds. I'm going to use this darkest color that matches that darkest piece of fabric where the orange bird is, and I'm going to stitch around them, making a nice outline to make them pop a bit. So here you can see I've gone around this first bird, and I'm liking the way that looks. So I'm going to stitch around all of the other birds too. Part of stitching intuitively is working in a way where you just do the next thing. You take the next idea that comes up, and then that leads to another idea and another idea. And with this piece, I had the idea to put the border on with those orange and pink colors because I felt like that's what I wanted next. And after I'd done that and I'd evaluated how that looked, I then had the idea of outlining the birds in this dark color. And I don't know if I would have thought of that if I hadn't done the step before of creating the border. So things just unfold from idea to idea, and more stitching gets added, more color gets added, and the piece evolves from there. So the next idea I have after stitching around these birds is that they need some branches. They need somewhere to be sitting. So I've pulled out 2 shades of brown that I feel like are good matches to the other colors. I've got one that is slightly darker than the other, and I think that they both would be good. It's possible here to bring out the erasable marking pen and draw some branches on. I don't think I'm going to do that here. I'm just going to stitch as I go and try to make the branches really organic. I'm using 2 strands of floss, and I've decided on the lighter color to start with, and I'm just going to stitch. So I'm starting underneath the bird, and I'm moving out to create this sort of end of the branch, actually. And I'm just doing straight stitches, and I'm trying to make the line sort of organic. slanting up and slanting down. And then I turn and go back and go underneath the bird, just trying to give the appearance that the bird's actually on that branch, resting there. And then once I get past the bird, I'm just going to sort of angle that branch down and go right off the side. So there's my first branch. I think I'm going to add another little offshoot from that and continue on and do the next bird. And this branch is going to be coming from the other side. And I'm just doing all this by eye. So I'm going to do this underneath each bird. So here are all my branches. I'll zoom in a bit so you can get a closer look. I made the ones for the bottom two birds, I made them share a branch, and I made it a little bit thicker. I'm thinking maybe it's lower on the tree. And also there's a darker color there, so I wanted it to show up. And now I'm going to add some claws to the bird. I'm going to use the same color that I used to outline the bird, that dark, dark teal. And this is really simple. I'm just making 3 little lines for each claw, coming underneath and stitching short little lines. And I'm eyeballing where I think the claws will be. And then that looks like they're actually hanging onto the branch. The pearl cotton I used to stitch around the edges of this piece has a matching color in the 6-stranded embroidery floss. And so I'm going to use the embroidery floss color to embellish this orange bird. I'm going to mark a place on the bird where I think the wing should be, just with some dots. And then I'm going to come in and stitch that wing. This color is not an exact match to the bird, but it is a match to the orange-red color that I've stitched around the edges with the blanket stitch. So I think it's going to look really good here. And it's a close enough match that it's going to give a tone-on-tone look. And that's what I'm going to do for the other birds. I found this color that when you see it wound on the spool, it looks like it's darker than the bird's. But when I take out 2 strands and I hold it up against the bird, it's a very close match. So I think that I'm going to use this color and it's going to show up a little more than it does on the orange, but it's still going to have that nice tonal effect. So here I've stitched the wings on all the birds, and I've done it slightly different for each of them. I've filled it in a little more on a few. And I'm going to continue in this tonal stitching idea, and I'm going to bring in white. I've already stitched white in the background, and I'm going to add some more. What I'm doing here are straight stitches, and I'm making marks. I'm putting them close together. I'm making some of them shorter and longer, and I'm not stitching them completely straight. This is going to add a little bit of interest to this upper area that has a little less visual detail. So there's the beginnings of my white marks, and I'm liking the way that that looks. It's very subtle, but it's adding a lot of texture. So I'm going to continue with this, and I'm going to add more in this upper section. So I've continued on adding these little scratch mark lines, and I'm really liking the effect that it's giving. I'm going to continue with white, and I'm going to outline my branches so they show up a little more. So you can see here on these bottom branches, I've already started, and it's really making them stand out. And what I'm doing is just stitching right along beside them with straight stitches, and it's making everything pop. So now I just want to continue adding more color and texture. So I'm bringing in this light green that's a nice match to some of the greens in the piece, and I'm going to add it in a few places. I'm going to start over in this darker area, and I'm hoping that this will blend it with the other pieces that are quite a bit lighter. And I'm going to do the same thing I did at the top, where I'm just making these little scratch marks. This is another part of the intuitive stitching process where I don't have a plan about exactly where I'm going to stitch. I just start moving around. This is what I call the wandering stitch, because I move across the piece and I stitch where I want, and it's adding color and texture as I go. So I've gone all over this darker patch, as you can see, and that's really added a lot and blended it in the way that I hoped that it would. When you look at the piece as one, it's getting more and more integrated. So I'm going to take that green stitching and I'm going to move it into the other places that don't have it yet. It's not going to show up as much, but it's going to unify everything. So here I've done lots more wandering stitch. I've also brought in this light blue, and the light blue matches the upper area, so I've brought that down into the piece as well. More integrating and lots more texture. Now I'm turning my attention back to the birds, and I'm bringing in a color that is just a little bit lighter than what I'd stitched before. And I'm going to stitch in the areas that I hadn't stitched previously. I've also chosen a color of orange that's slightly darker than the lighter color I'd chosen before, and I'm going to add some stitch in that color as well. This is just another layer of color and texture while still being tone on tone. I'm continuing to use 2 strands, and I'm just going to make straight stitches in the direction that I think the feathers will go. I'm holding this color of the pink up against the bird to see if it's going to give a nice tone on tone effect, and I'm liking it. So I'm going to do the same thing here with these birds, adding small stitches in the direction of the feathers, adding more and more texture. So my stitching's complete. I'm going to zoom in on these birds so you can see the nice texture that's been added. The entire piece is covered in stitching. There's straight stitches going in different directions of different lengths. Every little stitch adds so much. I'm so happy that I used up this scrap of patchwork. This has been such a fun piece to stitch, these tiny little birds perched together on the branches like a happy little flock. This stitched piece could be turned into a pouch. It could be another patch on my jean jacket, or I could mount it on canvas. There's so many options. I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with it, but I'm really happy with the result. I hope this inspires you to take a piece of scrap patchwork and create something beautiful. Thank you so much for joining me. Until next time, happy stitching.